So, the new Battlefield trailer came out earlier this week, and the gameplay trailer came out today, and I have to say that I am extremely excited for it. The new game, Battlefield 2042, takes place in the year, 2042. 21 years in the future, this game seems to actually have one of the most realistic settings that I have seen in any game. I did another video on the realism of the technology in the game and what the technology will look like in 21 years. In that regard, the game seems pretty damn accurate, but in this video I'm going to look at the geopolitics and the setting of the game. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, as well as follow me and ISRenell on Instagram, and let's get into the video. So this Battlefield takes place in the future, but it's not clear if the game is connected to the previous games in the franchise. From what I can tell, there hasn't really been any confirmation that these games are connected, generally speaking. It also doesn't seem to fully make sense if they are, since world wars between Russia, the US, and China would happen like 3 times within 30 years. Of course this is possible, but since there isn't really any hard evidence or confirmation that the games are connected, I won't touch on the other games here. On the Battlefield fandom page, however, there is a timeline that seems to put all the games in the same universe, but again, this isn't confirmed at all. So, what's going on in the world of Battlefield 2042? Well, fortunately, there's a whole timeline for this, which I'm putting in the description of the video courtesy of EA. The timeline starts in the early 2030s with a bleak picture of the world being painted. We learn that climate change, political instability, and resource shortages are the primary issues plaguing the world, and we get our first concrete event on October 29th, 2023, with Hurricane Zeta. We don't know where Zeta struck, although it was probably in the American Southeast and Caribbean area, but we do know that this was the world's first Category 6 storm. Whatever cities were hit were likely decimated, and massive flooding and destruction much worse than Hurricane Katrina is probably the result. A few months later, things get worse when on January 11th, 2034, food and fuel shortages around the world spark the Second Great Depression, this one likely more disastrous than the first. Political instability hits hard on August 8th, 2035, when the EU disbands after the collapse of Germany. This part is left vague, and honestly I have no idea if Germany of all places would collapse, or the nature of the collapse, but this implies some political or economic reason, given that Germany doesn't seem to be in any bad environmental trouble, and if it was, the surrounding countries would collapse as well, which would probably be mentioned. Maybe the migrant crisis overwhelmed the country, maybe some internal politics went really bad, or maybe the economic crash hits Germany especially hard, or some combination of those. Through this time, a massive group of people, officially known as the non-patrioted, start to emerge. These people, however, call themselves no-pats, and that's how they're known in the game and in the timeline. The no-pats are essentially massive groups of people that have been pushed from their homes due to political and environmental instability. Some areas of the globe presumably become uninhabitable, and the more developed areas cannot stand to allow more people. By 2037, there are 1.2 billion no-pats, and these people start to form a common identity beyond a nationality, doing what they can to live and survive wherever they are. They exist all around the world, and this massive amount of people is actually sort of similar to the people in the MCU who came back after the blip and have no place to go, cropping up in slums and abandoned areas to survive. These no-pats start to develop their own leadership, and the hashtag #WeAreNoPats becomes a social movement. At the same time, however, the world is starting to crawl back. Quote, revolutions in energy, desert irrigation, hydraulic levees, and seawalls save coastal cities, reclaim farmland, and rebuild supply chains. This redevelopment is not without its issues, however, as major powers start to come into conflict for the still scarce resources needed to facilitate growth. At this time, there are only 2 major powers, the United States and Russia, with China presumably falling victim to climate change or other socio-political factors, and thus no longer being a superpower. This upward trajectory, however, comes crashing down in 2040 when a Kessler effect happens. A Kessler effect is a theoretical event that essentially says that when enough stuff is in the low orbit of the Earth's atmosphere, it will cause a chain reaction of debris that would wipe out everything in the atmosphere. As a result of this, more than 70% of the world's satellites are destroyed. Instantly, the world changes for the worse, as planes crash, communication systems fail, and worldwide blackouts threaten the lives and well-being of billions. The economy collapses again, along with the global supply and trade routes, and, quote, a world on the edge goes over the brink. No internet, no navigation, no surveillance, and no storm forecasts. Prices for everything from grain to oil skyrocket, and some claim that 100,000 people die as a result. Like in all bad scenarios, people start looking for scapegoats. America blames the Russians, Russians blame the Americans, and both sides also blame the no-pats. As a result, the no-pats organize militaries to defend themselves and their interests, hoping to fight off enemies and maybe take more resources for themselves. All of this is of course worsened by the fact that spy technology is massively hampered due to the blackouts, and therefore it is harder for governments to trust each other. All of these tensions result in a shadow war between the US and Russia. To avoid full-scale war and escalation, however, both sides use no-pat fighters to do their bidding, offering them their own share of the world that they take. This is fourth-generation warfare at its peak, and these wars are heating up by the year 2042 when the game takes place. That's all we get from the timeline from the Battle 2042 website, but we can draw more conclusions about the conflict based off of the locations and people we see. Starting with the 7 base maps that we know of right now, we see that they are set in battlefields in Kourou, French Guiana, Doha, Qatar, Songdo, South Korea, Brani Island, Singapore, Alang, India, Queen Maud, Antarctica, and the Eastern Desert in Egypt. More context clues lay within the maps themselves. In French Guiana, on the map called Orbital, there is a rocket about to launch. Space programs, of course, would probably be a big part of the future conflict, especially in the aftermath of the Kessler effect, where various nations would be trying to relaunch satellites as quickly as possible. Looking at the map Hourglass in the capital of Qatar, we see the effects of climate change as the once powerful and rich city is being reclaimed by the surrounding desert. Qatar is the location of various American military bases, and in the future, of course, would be subject to a massive relocation effort and a hotspot for no-pats, as well as the US and Russia trying to get what they can out of the city before it's too late. Discarded in India is another victim of climate change, where we see that a port of massive ships, including a nuclear submarine, have been beached due to changing sea levels. Renewal in the Egyptian desert seems like an example of the aforementioned rebuilding of society in the face of climate change, and control for an agricultural area like this would be of key importance to whoever controlled it. Resource shortages seem to be the primary reason for the map breakaway in Antarctica, where one side or the other is exploiting the continent for its fuel reserves. Kaleidoscope in South Korea is the site of a quantum disinformation computer, which demonstrates the power of the digital world, while Manifest in Singapore serves as a key point in American supply lines, which both the US and Russia would have interests in controlling. We can also learn more about this world by looking at the specialists. While only 4 are available to us right now, we know that they are all no-pats, and their existence can shed light on what parts of the world are troubled. Starting with Webster McKay, we see that he is from Canada, which is rather interesting given that Canada would actually probably benefit from climate change, given that so much of the country is too cold to sustain lots of people. Then again, Germany fell, so maybe Canada did too. Perhaps Canada was the victim of incursions by the US, or from Russia trying to get closer to the US and weaken its more vulnerable allies. The next specialist, Maria Falk, is a German, and she is trying to find her son among the no-pats. As we saw earlier, Germany collapsed somehow, and she is likely a no-pat as a result. Pyotr Boris Gostovsky is a Russian and is portrayed as a more suspicious character. Perhaps Boris is a Russian plant and not actually a no-pat, which would make sense since it's unlikely that either side would let the NOPATs operate without being able to monitor or control them. He may actually be a NOPAT though, as Russia is quite large, and it wouldn't be surprising if it had significant problems in this timeline. The fourth specialist, Wikus Casper van Dale, is from South Africa, which implies that much of Africa has also been compromised in this future. In total, we have 11 confirmed problem areas that we know of so far in this world: South Korea, Singapore, India, Qatar, Egypt, South Africa, Russia, Germany, Canada, French Guiana, and Antarctica. The question is, how realistic is this map? And maybe more interestingly, can we try and predict where other maps specialists will be? Well, let's look at the pattern we have right now. Climate change is drastically affecting many parts of the world, and every place from Africa to Germany is having serious problems either as a direct result or because of second-order socio-political or economic effects. Areas that have been most affected are places where NOPATs come from, and areas that have some potential use to the world powers tend to be the zones of conflict. In short, do the NOPAT origin areas have some sort of major issue, and do the areas where there is combat have some resource that is important for either the US or Russia to control? Let's start with the specialists. Germany has been established as a collapsed state in this timeline, but off the top of my head, I couldn't really see how this could happen in Germany, at least not if the surrounding countries were fine. Until we get an explanation or some wider context, I'm going to say that the fall of Germany and only Germany within the EU seems unrealistic, but it will still inform our predictions on where conflict zones could be and where specialists could hail from. Canada is in the same boat, but even more unrealistic in my estimation, given that Canada would benefit from global warming much more than any other country. But again, it gives us a data point that the world of 2042 sees large-scale problems in extremely developed countries. Russia is another weird one, since we know that it is sufficiently viable to challenge the US as a world power, and thus probably doesn't have issues that are as bad as the rest of the world. I could see issues along the Mongolian or Chinese borders, of course, as these areas could be subject to desertification of some sort. By far the most likely of these specialist countries is South Africa. South Africa is at a very high risk of drought and is surrounded by water on three sides, making it very susceptible to rising sea levels. In 2017, for example, one of the capitals of the country, Cape Town, almost entirely ran out of water, and more climate change and supply shortages would make this even worse in the future. So, can we guess where the other 6 specialists will come from? Maybe. I'm left to guess at the other 4, and I'd say that my guess for the most likely areas to have specialists would be the American Southeast or coastal Australia, El Salvador or Honduras, India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central Asia or the Middle East. India has big problems with overpopulation, superbugs that can't be cured with antibiotics, and a growing authoritarian sentiment in addition to being a prime victim of climate change, and that's all right now in the real world. It also has so many people that it would be hard to not have one of the 10 NOPATs from here. China is about the same logic to it, and given that it has collapsed in this universe, I think it's even more likely to be a big source of NOPATs. Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Nigeria, seems to be a big area for NOPATs to come from as well. Nigeria specifically is dealing with desertification, overpopulation, and is a coastal country, making it all worse. It also is a country with a massive population. I don't know if the Middle East or Central Asia is more likely to be on this list, since both are having big problems, but I might lean a bit more towards Central Asia, since the Middle East is already such a shit show that they've already collapsed in the real world, which would reduce the population of the region and thus the likelihood of NOPATs coming from there. If I had to guess a Central Asian country, I would say something like Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan. As for the areas of conflict, let's start with the obvious outliers. Antarctica is a place where we haven't really seen much in the shooter games, but in this future I think it's totally accurate. Resource shortages, especially in oil and natural gas, would have to be resolved somehow, and Antarctica has lots of untapped resources, including lots of iron and rock exposure in the area of the Antarctica map. French Guiana is another weird one, but a little bit of research shows that the city where the battle takes place is actually the only European space launch site. This particular launch site makes sense, since in this timeline China has collapsed, and the Russian and American launch sites would be too well protected, but this would be a place that could actually be contested. Moving to the Middle East, Egypt is another very likely place for fighting in a future like this. Not only would issues of desertification and global warming change Egypt, but a damming project by Ethiopia in the not-too-distant future also threatens to dam the Nile and effectively end Egypt as a country. Moving to Doha, we see that the desert is reclaiming the city, but that the city is still very much lit up and seems to be thriving. This is possibly because Doha is on the coast of the Persian Gulf, which is a major area for oil exports, making this region another very likely place for conflict. Moving to India, we see that there is fighting for a port which has been affected by changing sea levels. In real life, this area of Alang is actually a scrapping area for large ships, so this is also accurate, although I'm not totally sure if in the real world the Alang port is above water or not. In terms of being a combat zone, India is another hotspot since India is a nuclear power with a massive population, which is likely to collapse in this timeline. As a result, India is an amazing place to scavenge resources, especially metal, so this entry makes sense as well. Additionally, there would be many no-pats around here to fight against both America and Russia. Allegedly, there is a nuclear submarine in the map, which also is feasible, and given the corruption and consistent issues that appear in the Indian government in recent decades, it's not too surprising that India would let this happen. The US and Russia also have done a lot for recovering nuclear submarines in real life, although it is mostly under the radar. Singapore is a major point in American supply lines, which also makes sense since Singapore is a more westernized country in the South Pacific. If this were a major area for supply lines, maybe for exporting the resources from India and Antarctica to the US, then of course the Russians would want to control this area and the Americans would fight for it. South Korea is, in my opinion, the most interesting of these maps, since the fighting is over a quantum disinformation computer. Quantum computers are just developing now, but as I discuss in my other video on battlefield tech in the future, digital tech doubles its speed about every 2 years. It's also telling that the quantum computer is being used for disinformation, which shows that the online fight with disinformation and riling up opposing populations is alive and well in the future. If the computer is in Korea, it is probably an American one for messing with Russia, since Korea is an American ally. The Koreans are also a very technologically inclined country, so a big computer being there makes sense, especially if they aren't as badly affected by the goings-on of the world, and they could invest more time into making bigger computers than fighting for resources. I think all of these areas are very likely hot zones for combat, but I think a few more areas are great candidates as well. The biggest of these is China. Since China isn't a superpower in 2042, it's safe to say that the country has some major collapse, making it a prime area for the Russians and Americans to try and pick up the pieces for themselves. The likely battle areas would be southern areas of the country, since Russia would be close enough to easily control most of China. I could see fighting in coastal areas like Shanghai, or fighting along the Chinese-Indian border, especially over dams. This would make sense since India would probably be an American ally and China a Russian one, so the dams would be a major proxy war in that area, with the Russians trying to keep the dams up for hydroelectric power and the Americans trying to destroy the dams to reinvigorate India as a regional power. Also, for those who don't know, China is currently trying to dam up major Indian tributaries, including the Ganges, which will likely be the cause of a massive conflict in the near future. A similar conflict could also take place in Central Asia, either over a dam or a checkpoint along the Belt and Road Initiative, which is another project for China. In short, China is fixing to be the #1 player in the world over the coming decades, and if that collapses along with its projects around the world in Central Asia and Africa, then it would be the #1 place for the remaining superpowers. In other regions, I could see fighting in areas like the Panama Canal, Nairobi, Kenya, and the Indus Valley or the collapsed Germany. In short, I think that Battlefield has done a very good job at making a realistic, albeit very bleak future for the world. I still have questions about the collapse of Germany, issues in Canada, and the absence of China as a world power, but other than that, I think that things are extremely accurate. If you've made it this far, but other than that, I think that things are extremely accurate. If you've made it this far, remember to check out my other video on the technology of 2042, And remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.